I took over the executive power and sent strong troops of all arms into the threatened districts.
March 1912. In the Ruhr Valley, the heart of Germany's industrial empire, coal miners leave their pits in protest. Nearly 190,000 men lay down their tools. Factories fall silent. Tension spreads through the workers' colonies. From the east come the soldiers, the 8th Hussars, a proud cavalry regiment of the Prussian army. Their horses clatter over cobblestone streets once built for miners' carts. They are not heading into foreign battlefields, but into the smoky heart of Germany's own industry. Their mission: to uphold order, to secure obedience, to remind all who watched that behind the civil police stood the full power of the Kaiser's army. For the miners of the Ruhr, these riders were not soldiers of war. They were soldiers of peace, bearing the authority of the empire itself. This is the story of how Imperial Germany blurred the line between soldier and policeman, and why the military became the ultimate guarantor of domestic control. The rapid industrialization of the Ruhr Valley exposed these contradictions more than anywhere else. When in 1889 nearly 100,000 miners struck, the Prussian state sent in the army. The experience convinced officials that relying on troops was politically dangerous. After 1889, the government reorganized the Gendarmerie in the Ruhr, a project later known as the Arnsberg system. It aimed to prevent future military interventions by strengthening local policing and surveillance. By 1892, the number of gendarmes in the region had doubled, and the Ruhr had the highest density of police in the empire. But urbanization soon undermined this. As mining settlements grew into independent towns, they left the gendarmerie's jurisdiction. By 1900, the entire system of rural military policing was losing ground to urban civil forces, less disciplined but more numerous. The Prussian state now had to balance between two models: the old soldier police and the new civil worker police. In March 1912, the largest miners' strike in Imperial Germany's history broke out. About 190,000 miners participated, paralyzing the Ruhr. The strike divided the labor movement itself. The Christian Miners' Union opposed, which allowed the government to denounce the action as political agitation by the Social Democrats. Authorities declared the task not to mediate, but to protect the willing workers who refused to strike. Police and gendarmes were sent in first. They set up cordons around the mines, patrolled railway lines, and broke up gatherings. Reports spoke of police armed not only with sabers but also with carbines, occupying entire streets and confronting even peaceful pickets. As tensions grew, violence erupted. Several miners were shot and killed, not by soldiers but by the police. The authorities, overwhelmed and fearing escalation, requested military support. From Münster and Arnsberg came the call to General Karl von Einem, commander of the 7th Army Corps. He ordered the deployment of approximately 5,000 soldiers, including the 8th Hussars, cavalry, infantry and machine gun units. Beneath the soldiers there were about 20 troopers of the 8th Hussars and some officers of the regiment. Von Einem assumed executive power under the siege law, but acted with calculated restraint. Indeed, the soldiers did not fire their weapons, but their presence transformed the situation. Entire mining towns were surrounded by cavalry patrols. Columns of the 8th Hussars rode through settlements, dismounting to occupy key intersections and mine entrances. Their mission was not combat, but deterrence. They operated under civil direction, guided by local police, who identified strike leaders and potential trouble spots. It seems like the arrival of military restored order while stabilizing the police. Von Einem even rejected Kaiser Wilhelm II's suggestions to employ machine guns and artillery should resistance arise. He knew that the mere display of force sufficed. After days, the strike collapsed. There were no deaths from army fire, but several miners had already fallen to police bullets. The episode revealed the complex relationship between police and army at the end of the Kaiserreich. The army remained the guarantor of order, yet its restraint depended on coordination with civil authorities. The 8th Hussars thus symbolized the presence of military power, visible, disciplined, and intimidating, yet they also marked the state's growing caution in using open violence. Their silent patrols through the Ruhr became a living image of the empire's paradox: peace enforced by soldiers. The 8th Hussars remained in the Ruhr for 3 weeks. Their presence, cavalry patrols through workers' districts, sabers visible on every street corner, broke the strike without a single charge. The miners returned to the pits. Order was restored. The system had worked. But General von Einem's orders were not improvisation, and it was no coincidence that workers were shot by the police while no one was killed by the army. The authority that sent Hussars into German streets was built over 40 years. From the moment Prussia unified Germany, through military victory in 1871. To understand why Hussars stood in factory gates in 1912, we must return to 1871, when Germany itself was forged by military victory. At the core of the German Imperial Constitution of 1871 lay an instrument of control, Article 68. It declared that the Kaiser could, in case of a threat to public security, proclaim a state of siege. This extraordinary measure was not a relic of war alone. It drew directly from the Prussian law on the state of siege of 1851, which extended military authority into times of internal unrest, even, as it said, im Falle des Aufruhrs, or in cases of riot. Once the state of siege was proclaimed, the executive power passed to the military commanders, while civil, administrative and municipal authorities were bound to obey the orders and directives of the military. This transfer of power from civil to military hands revealed an essential paradox of the Kaiserreich. Order was a civic virtue, but its defense was a martial duty. The roots of this system reached back to the Tumultverordnung of 1789, the first regulation explicitly authorizing military assistance to police forces in suppressing crowds. A later cabinet order of 1820 permitted even independent action by the army during unrest, an authority reaffirmed in the instructions of the use of weapons of 1899. In the Tumultverordnung of 1835, commanders were obliged to call up in a crowd 3 times to disperse before using force. The 1851 instruction on the use of weapons was clear. If even after the 3rd warning obedience is not immediately rendered, the military will enforce it through the use of weapons. Though the law advised moderation, weapons were to be used only to the extent necessary to achieve the intended purpose. Even a dangerous threat could justify lethal force to overcome resistance. By 1912, even without a formal declaration of siege, this principle remained. Command authority shifted automatically to the local military commander when troops were deployed internally. The separation between civilian and military authority, so carefully theorized in Britain, was in Prussia never absolute. In Great Britain, the unconditional subordination of the army to government was a settled doctrine. In Prussia, the military retained extensive autonomy. Yet in both states, the army could be requisitioned by civil authorities when the police were overwhelmed. The difference lay not in legality, but in the spirit of command, the latitude granted to officers, and the speed with which bayonets were called upon to restore peace. To understand the nature of policing in Imperial Germany, one must begin with the Gendarmerie, the state's armed rural police force, founded in the Napoleonic tradition but molded by Prussian discipline. The Gendarmerie occupied a unique position between soldier and civil servant. Its members patrolled villages and small towns, often alone, armed and mounted, representing both the state and its military ethos. They wore uniforms nearly identical to those of the army. They held ranks familiar to any soldier, sergeant, corporal, and were subject to military law. The gendarme was a soldier in peacetime, tasked not with defending borders, but with enforcing obedience at home. In an issue from 1892, the Vorwärts, or translated Forward, which was a newspaper by Social Democrats, is a short description of how the gendarmerie was seen by the workers.
Born in Hinterpommern, attended village school, grew beetroot, became a soldier, surrendered, rose to the rank of corporal, learned to write and do basic arithmetic, trained recruits, became a sergeant, trained recruits, became a vice sergeant, still trained recruits, obtained a civilian supply certificate and finally became a police officer.
In contrast, the urban police developed within municipalities, financed and directed by local administrations. The city police forces were bureaucratically civilian, but in spirit and training they too bore the imprint of the army. For much of the 19th century, recruitment for both branches drew almost exclusively from former military personnel. This practice was based on the belief that discipline, loyalty, and respect for hierarchy could only be learned under arms. The police were, in the words of contemporary observers, a continuation of the army by other means. Yet, this military origin also carried its own tensions. As cities expanded, as social conflicts deepened, the old soldierly type of policeman often proved ill-equipped for the complexities of industrial society. The Prussian authorities were well aware of this dilemma. Basically, the task of the police was not only to command, but to comprehend, not only to subdue, but to maintain. By the turn of the century, the state began to consider a shift, the recruitment of civilian workers into the police ranks. But this transition was far from smooth. The established officer corps of the gendarmerie viewed the newcomers with suspicion. In the rigid hierarchy of Wilhelmine society, even a police inspector, once a non-commissioned officer, could never fully transcend his origins. As the police chief of Schwelm, Laufer, wrote in 1903,
"Even if he commands a corps of hundreds, he is not regarded as socially equal." How is it to be explained, for example, that the police and gendarmerie have so little contact? The reason lies clearly in the fact that the gendarmerie officers, as former officers of the army, see in the police superior only the former non-commissioned officer, and avoid all official and social contact with him.
This reflected a deeper social rift, one that separated the military aristocracy from the bureaucratic lower middle class and even working class that filled the ranks of the police. By the early 20th century, the situation had become increasingly untenable. The gendarmerie, tied to rural administration, was losing influence in the rapidly urbanizing Ruhr district. As industrial settlements became cities, they fell under municipal police control and the gendarmerie's authority shrank. A memorandum from the Ansbeck district government in 1905 warned of this development, that the local administrations were politically unreliable and organizationally weak. The influence of the district councils diminished, while the urban proletariat grew ever more restless. At the same time, the recruitment base of the police was shifting. No longer composed solely of disciplined ex-soldiers, the police increasingly drew from the lower civilian strata, men with limited education, often former workers themselves. This democratization of recruitment improved the police local knowledge and accessibility, but weakened their cohesion and social standing. With the decline of army recruitment as a source of manpower, new policemen increasingly came from the very class they were meant to control, the industrial working class. The recruit of the executive service was no longer a former soldier, but often a worker who seeks in state service a more secure livelihood. This shift brought a deep social contradiction. The policeman was now both of the working class and against it. He wore the uniform of authority, yet shared the origins, the speech, and often the sympathies of those he was ordered to disperse. The administration saw this ambivalence as a problem. Reports from the Interior Ministry warned that the new recruits lacked the unconditional obedience once instilled by the barracks and that they needed to be trained to think and act as representatives of the state, not as members of their former class. The former soldier brought with him blind obedience and a familiarity with command and order. The civil servant recruited from the working class, on the other hand, must first relearn these virtues. For many, joining the police meant a social crossing and a loss. The worker who entered the ranks of the executive service often left behind his old social ties. He was no longer accepted in his former milieu, where the police were seen as instruments of repression. At the same time, within the corps, he remained marked as a man without military schooling, viewed with suspicion by older superiors. The worker in uniform stood between two worlds, alien to both. Thus emerged a quiet inner tension between the origins of these men and the authority they now embodied. They were, as one commentator put it, servants of order drawn from a class in disorder, a paradox at the heart of Imperial Germany's system of control. The old military ethos persisted, but it was increasingly a facade. Behind the polished boots and parade uniforms, behind the polished boots and parade formations, the police were becoming something new, a social institution caught between state authority and working class life. This tension would define their role in the coming industrial crisis of the empire. The intervention of 1912 was not an isolated event, but the outcome of a century-long evolution. From the 1789 tumult decree to Article 68 of the 1871 Constitution, from the gendarmerie's founding to the police recruitment reforms, the fusion of civil administration and military discipline defined Prussian governance. In Britain, the army was explicitly subordinate to the civil power. In Prussia, the opposite held true. The military possessed the legal and moral right to assume control in times of unrest. Even as the empire approached modernity, the shadow of the army loomed over all instruments of internal order. The police carried sabers like soldiers, recruited men in uniform, and marched to the same rhythms of discipline and command. The saber and the statue, both instruments of rule. By 1914, when war broke out, this structure was complete. The state of siege was proclaimed throughout Germany, placing the army once again at the helm of governance. The Hussars, quite patrols through the Ruhr in 1912, were thus a foretaste of what was to come. The militarization not only of the battlefield, but of society itself. For generations, Prussia, and later the German Empire, built its order up in armed authority. From the gendarmes' rural patrol to the Hussars' cavalry charge, from the police recruit drilled like a soldier to the general who ruled under the siege law. The boundaries between army and police blurred until they became one system. Yet in between, hopes for civil structured police were high, but it only lasted until the end of the war. It was a system born of fear, of revolution, of disorder, of the crowd. But it also reflected a deep conviction that order was not a natural condition, but something that had to be imposed. When the Hussars rode through the Ruhr, they were not merely suppressing a strike. They were performing the final act of a long history in which the obedience and authority had become inseparable. A history that defined Imperial Germany until its end in 1918. So that's it for today. Thank you all for watching, have a good one, and see you next time. Bye!